I want to begin by wishing everybody Ramadan Kareem. It is a joy and privilege to be with you all. I join you today from my office at Kwantlen Polytechnic University, which is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples. And that includes the Kwantlen First Nation, who graciously bestowed their name on our university. For context, KPU is an open access public post-secondary institution in British Columbia. We serve over 20,000 students each year. Just switch my slides over here so I can keep going. About 72% of our students are multilingual, 35% are first-gen students, 29% of whom have a disability or ongoing condition that affects their studies, and 24% of whom do not identify as heterosexual. So ours is a diverse and thriving community located within some of the fastest growing and most diverse cities in Canada. What you're seeing on the left of the screen is some of the beautiful artwork that Kwantlen First Nation artist Brandon Gabriel created for the center courtyard at one of our campuses. And on the right, one of several crosswalks on our campuses that proudly point towards progress. I began this talk with a territorial acknowledgement, which of course is only the tiniest reflection of the ongoing process of truth and reconciliation in Canada. Truth, of course, must come before reconciliation. And this includes not denying or minimizing the historical or indeed the ongoing violence that is perpetrated against Indigenous peoples across North America. For example, some of you will know that over the past year, there have been thousands of unmarked graves discovered at the sites of former residential schools across Canada. These were places where Indigenous children were taken far away from their families as part of a government-sponsored, church-perpetrated campaign to educate the Indian out of the child. This is a form of cultural genocide that both Canada and the Catholic Church have acknowledged far too late. And I share this with you in part to illustrate just how education has historically been and how it continues to be weaponized. Of course, those of you who teach and work in places such as Florida will know this all too well with the recent adoption of the Don't Say Gay bill. And so I hope that as we consider new teaching strategies, demonstrations, approaches, and the other information shared during this wonderful event, that we also reflect on the values that we bring to this work as educators, the things that attracted us to this work in the first place. And Lindsay, I think, spoke beautifully to this yesterday. And I think ours is not neutral work, nor should it be. Neutrality, of course, always serves the oppressor, and this is certainly true in the case of higher education as well. So I think if you could talk about legacy admissions or high textbook costs, the design of learning experiences that assume that students are neither working nor have parental responsibilities, for example, that you look at the crushing problem of student debt or the painful reality of food and housing insecurity, the growing precarity among casualized non-tenure track faculty, or the common approach to accessibility that places the burden on individual students who need to be accommodated instead of ensuring that learning environments are designed to be inclusive. And it is especially true, I think, when it comes to teaching and learning in digital spaces as well, right? Algorithms, for example, are certainly not apolitical. Consider Google search as an example. As Safia Noble has written in her book, Algorithms of Oppression, search is a symbiotic process that both informs and is informed in part by users. And yet, if a majority rules in search engine results, then how might those who are in the minority ever be able to influence or control the way in which they are represented in a search engine? Consider, for example, the results that show up when you Google unprofessional hairstyles for work, and compare these with the results that show up when you Google professional hairstyles for work. Or consider, for example, that when you paste text into Google Translate from Finnish, which is a language that has only one pronoun for the third person, regardless of the gender, it translates into English in a way that isn't just gendered, but also sexist. He is a journalist. He is a leader. She is exhausted. She has a grandchild. He works. She has a headache. She is taking care of the child. You can see where I'm going with this. And of course, none of this is an accident, right? Just as the development of racist soap dispensers that would not detect Black customers' hands was not an accident. It's a function of design. It's a reflection and in many ways an amplification of societal biases, of unquestioning techno-solutionism, but also dominant and male culture. And higher education is not immune to this. right? This is how we end up with, for example, digital textbook platforms that do not include proper accessibility tools. This is how we end up with learning management systems that do not permit the use of preferred names, and so instead dead names trans students. This is how we end up with remote exam proctoring software with algorithms that more likely flag students with darker skin tones as cheating. In her book, Race After Technology, Ruha Benjamin refers to this as the new Jim Code, the employment of new technologies that reflect and reproduce existing inequities, but that are promoted and perceived as more objective or more progressive than the discriminatory systems of a previous era. As has been noted many times, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. And this is why design justice is so important. As Sasha Constanza Schock writes, design justice is a framework for analysis of how design distributes the benefits and burdens between various groups of people. Design justice focuses explicitly on ways that design reproduces and or challenges the matrix of domination, which can include things like white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, capitalism, ableism, and settler colonialism, for example. And of course, beyond talking about digital teaching and learning, we should talk about psychology. I really appreciated the presentation earlier today, the applied psychology conversation that touched on many elements of this. But of course, there is quite a history within our discipline, and we're not immune to these forces. I need only remind you of things like the Hoffman Report into APA's practices regarding the relaxation of ethical standards for psychologists involved in torture investigations, and the subsequent apology for these deeply disturbing findings and organizational failures. I quote, the Hoffman Report states that the intent of the individuals who participated in the collusion, and these were APA representatives, by the way, was to curry favor with the Defense Department, and that may have enabled the government's use of abusive interrogation techniques. Or how about the recent apology of the APA to people of color for APA's role in promoting, perpetuating, and failing to challenge racism and racial discrimination? There was a lot in this statement, so I'll just share a few nuggets if you haven't read it. Whereas psychology cannot harness its potential to disarm and dismantle racism without addressing its own history of racism and support for human hierarchy. Whereas APA was established by white male leadership, many of whom contributed to the scientific inquiry and methods that perpetuated systemic racial oppression, including promoting the ideas of early 20th century eugenics. Whereas psychologists created, sustained, and promulgated ideas of human hierarchy through the construction, study, and interpretation of racial difference, and therefore contributed to the financial wealth gap and social class disparities experienced by many communities of color. Whereas psychology has minimized and marginalized psychologists from communities of color and their contributions to the field. And whereas APA and its leadership have failed to take concerted action in response to calls from Black psychologists, many of whom later formed ABPSI for an end to the misuse of testing and assessment practices and interventions in education and the workplace developed by psychologists and others that have perpetuated racial inequality. I do recommend that you read the whole thing, but goodness, this is just a few of the excerpts here. Or how about the Society for the Teaching of Psychology's recent statement on addressing systemic racism and inequity within that organization? Again, just an excerpt. The executive committee acknowledges and recognizes that our organization has been complicit in perpetuating institutionalized and structural racial inequities. We have failed to fully and adequately lead and develop an organization that is equitable and inclusive. And we recognize the negative impact of our failure and that our failure has had on representation in the field and throughout SCP. They went on to offer a sincere apology to faculty members and instructors of color, as well as current and former members of the organization who've been negatively impacted in these ways, and certainly looking to strive to do better in the future. So I'm raising all of this because I think, when you think about how popular our discipline is, particularly at the undergraduate level, right, we remain the third most popular undergraduate degree. It is quite shocking if you start to reflect on just how much systemic, structural, academic gatekeeping is necessary to keep the professoriate in psychology. Of course, Java wants to update right now, why not? To keep the professoriate in psychology and indeed our discipline's leadership so very white. This is not a natural reflection of the undergraduate representation in our discipline at all. And so I raise these examples from our systems, from our discipline. There's been lots of research about, or a lot of articles over the last year in particular, as psychology comes to grips with this past and of course the present as well. Share one more over here. So of course, there's a long way to go. But I'm sharing these examples also because I speak from my own experience over here. I observe through my own lens. And so I will also take the opportunity to share a little bit about my positionality. I look at, higher education in many ways as having this incredible transformative potential, as how it is a force for economic and social mobility, how it's a tool with which we can unlock human potential. And yet I confess, the more I look at the structures of higher education, I see ways, blunt and subtle, in which it reinforces and replicates existing societal power hierarchies. So I will share a bit about myself here. I've been very grateful to call Canada home for the past 23 years, but I grew up in Bombay in India. It's a mega city of over 25 million people in a country of extremes. And so, for example, Mumbai, as it's called today, is home to one of the largest slums in Asia and also the most valuable private residence in the world. And my childhood, I'm going to share some fun photos with you over here, was atypical because it was one of privilege. Here I am with my mother and my sister. English was my first language, my language at both home and school. And here I am with my grandfather on my 10th birthday. You can see I'm rocking some yellow suspenders over there. And so our family was reasonably wealthy, and I didn't really want for anything. But I will say privilege is a very funny thing because, I think it's really hard to understand privilege until you lose it, at least in part. And that's precisely what happened. My father suffered a series of heart attacks, series of financial setbacks. We lost our home, and then my father passed away. And so the future that was very secure suddenly became desperately uncertain. And so this is when my grandparents took me in. They gave me a home. This is me with them when I was a teenager. My grandfather, who was a freedom fighter during India's struggle for independence, shared many stories with me, including about the time when he and his friends laid down on the roads to block the passage of British trucks. And some years later, when I wanted to pursue a higher education, they were the ones who invested in me, made it possible for me to move to Canada to study. I remember how much I struggled during those early years. But it was a new country, a new life, far away from family. But one of the things I did not struggle with, thankfully, was my studies, because I knew that every semester that I excelled, every semester that I made the dean's list, those letters of commendation would make their way back to my grandparents in India. And I really wanted to make them proud. And so a year and a half later, when I moved to Canada, or after I moved to Canada, my grandparents came to visit me, for example. I just about found a new job. Options are limited for international students at the time. So I started to be able to pay my own college tuition fees. And it was the summer in Vancouver, which is honestly a spectacularly beautiful time to visit here if you ever have the opportunity. It's when they film all the tourism videos. And my grandparents spent 3 wonderful, unforgettable weeks with me before going on to visit with my grandfather's brother in Massachusetts. But then something interesting happened. My grandmother decided that she wanted to go back home early. So they cut short their trip. They flew back to India. 7 days after landing in Bombay, my grandmother passed away. And 10 days after that, my grandfather passed away. Now, by itself, I don't think that this story is that unusual because this was a couple who had been married for more than 50 years. But what I do think is unusual and why this story is bittersweet for me is that I think it's very rare to get to spend time with people who matter that much to you, who've changed your life that dramatically just before they pass. And so it was a huge privilege, and that memory is something I hold on to very, very close to my heart. But I also can tell you with confidence that if it were not for my grandparents' faith in me, for their support of me, I would not have moved to Canada to study. I would not have become a Canadian citizen. I would not have become a university professor or administrator. And I certainly wouldn't be speaking with you today. And so I'm sharing all of this with you because when people say that education is a vehicle for economic and social mobility, that it can unlock human potential, this idea is not a theoretical construct for me. It is very much my lived experience. And it's also why I've been naturally drawn to conversations and labor around widening equitable access to education. It really connects to the heart of my origin story as an educator. And so I want to pause over here and ask you to reflect similarly on your own positionality. Reflect on the elements of your history that connect with your identity as an educator. Reflect on your origin story. And then I'm going to ask you to share a word or even a phrase that captures some of this. So I've set up a small poll everywhere over here. And you can do this by either opening a browser on your screen or indeed using your mobile device and scanning the QR code. But it's just a single open-ended question. And what I'd love for you to do is share a word or a phrase that reflects at least one of your values as an educator. And I'll give you a minute or so to do this, and we'll look at where we land. But I think this will really help inform both our conversation for the next while, but also to help organize your own processing. You can see some of the responses are coming in. Compassion, equity, compassion's growing. I love it. And of course, I recognize that I've primed you a little bit over here, but I think the theme of the conference has very much been around inclusion and leading with trust and compassion when it comes to teaching and learning. We'll keep this open for another 30 seconds or so. Inclusive, curiosity, utility. Everything's anchored by compassion at the moment. Thank you for sharing this. Love. I think that's a beautiful word to include over there. Right? It's insightful, it's beautiful, and I'm hoping that you can see some of your own shared values on here as well. Because I think one of the challenges is when we get caught up in the routine work of teaching and learning, the emails, the slide deck creation, the building of activities in the learning management system, the reading of new articles in teaching journals, office hours, the grading. We catch flashes of it now and again, right? Those meaningful one-on-one conversations with students, the faces that light up when an insight is achieved in the classroom, or the lingering chats following a lecture. And of course, those updates from students who, after they graduate, they tell us about how we've influenced their journey, or indeed those hugs at graduation ceremonies as well. But I think it's easy to forget this deeper meaning of our work, right, which has to do with ensuring that education does serve societal transformation. And I will say that I think in psychology, we're really quite fortunate over here in that we have rather a lot to offer when it comes to societal transformation, whether it comes to better understanding and aiding physical and mental well-being, or understanding the root causes of prejudice, or designing interventions to mitigate climate change, or even applying principles of human factors design and cognitive ergonomics. There's a lot that we have to share the world. But I will venture to suggest that as teachers of psychology, the deeper meaning of our work really should go further still. And so, change my slides over here. I think it's about helping support the personal and intellectual growth of our students. It's about fostering a sense of belonging. And it's about working to really try to bend, in my view, that arc towards justice. Yesterday, Lindsay asked us to reflect on our best experiences as learners. And I would guess that these reflections were more a function of how your teachers made you feel than the specific knowledge that was shared. And so I'd like to share one more story with you over here. This is about how I found my way into psychology. Because also, although I did well academically as an international student, I can tell you it wasn't all smooth sailing when I first got here. Because before I left India, this is such a tale about higher ed. I took an exam called the Test of English as a Foreign Language, or the TOEFL for short. And that's hilarious because English is my first language. Anyway, the colleges I was applying to required it, so I took it, right? And I aced it, of course. But it wasn't enough because the specific college that I was attending also wanted me to take their special, localized, specific English test. So I'm thinking, fine, my early lesson on how systems in higher education are not designed to accommodate individual difference. But one more expensive hoop, no problem, I signed up. But here's the problem. On the day of the test, I went to take the bus to go to the college, and I made a fatal mistake. Because in India, when you take a bus from point A to point B, it has a certain number. But when it's going in the reverse journey, it has a different number. Not so in Vancouver. As it turned out, I did not know this. And so I took the right number bus heading in the wrong direction. And so I ended up, I think I was walking onto like a major bridge across an inlet now. And I'm thinking this definitely is not anywhere close to the college. And so basically, long story short, I lost my way. I missed my booked test. And when I could next reschedule it, it meant that I missed my early registration date. So this was interesting because I moved halfway around the world specifically to pursue a particular program of study, which connected with my background as a in the performing arts. It was a theater program. And so, I go there and finally I go to register and all the theater classes are full, every single one. And so imagine for a moment, I'm sitting over there pondering, this future career is vanishing in front of my eyes. I'm by myself trying to figure out what I'm going to do. And an advisor across the table says, why don't you take psychology? I said, sure, sign me up. I mean, she could have said, why don't you take pottery at that point, right? I think I would have said yes to anything at that point. I was just in a kind of disconsolate state. But, I will say when I moved to Canada all those years ago, because of my passion, this was dance, by the way, it was more than a passion. I was a member of a dance company for several years. We performed in, musical theater, music videos, and yes, Bollywood movies as well. So I taught dance to kids as young as 4 and people into their 60s. But the lifestyle of a dancer is interesting because, it's hard work, it's long hours of rehearsals, it's constantly training, but it's always joyous, right? It's about connecting with others. And I think, I don't know if Lindsay would agree with me, but I think in my mind, at its best, dance is sort of an inspiring and transformative storytelling experience. And so that morning at the registration desk, I was really contemplating leaving behind that lifestyle, those dreams. And then something magical happened, because during my first semester in that college, I encountered an instructor who cared. His name, I will share freely, is Michael McNeil. And Michael knew that I was far from home, and he noticed that despite I was doing well in class, I was quiet, I was shy. So he reached out to me to see how I was getting on out of school. And he asked me to stay out after class for a quick chat. And it sounds simple, right? It's what we do all the time. But I promise you, it was everything to me. I was lonely. I was terrified of messing up. It was embarrassing to have to constantly ask for help with things like, and you'll find this silly, but how do I photocopy articles in the library? Again, cultural difference. In India, there's a guy for everything, right? There's a guy who mans the photocopy machine. You hand him your thing, and the librarians are telling me, there's the photocopy machine. I was like, okay, all right, where's the guy? All those, what is this, combination locks? That's not a thing where I grew up. Like those twisty turny ones. It was so scary to me. I couldn't get a locker because I couldn't figure out the dang combination locks. Honestly, it's, with culture shock, it's not the big things, it's the subtle things that'll trip you up. And those were 2 good examples. So, in the context of all of that, Michael cared, but he went above and beyond that. So a year later, my mom moved as well to Canada. She's an artist. He bought a painting from her. He went well above and beyond what an instructor needs to do, right? He basically cared. And I'm sharing this with you because what I will never forget is I was in the middle of that semester and I knew how he was making me feel. I went to the bus stop, I was on my way home, and I remember praying as earnestly and as deeply as I've prayed in my life, because I knew in that moment, I said, I know what I want to do. This is what I want to do. This is what I want to do to other students. This is what I want to do for other students. This is how I want to make them feel. I knew in that first semester that I wanted to become a university professor because of him. And it had nothing to do with the content of psychology, right? It had to do with how he approached teaching and learning, the sense of belonging that he gave me, particularly as a terrified new international student. And so this is what Lindsay talked about, I think, as a human-centered approach. But of course, we know that this is not the only approach that is out there, certainly, right? And nor is it the modal approach. As the amazing Vijay Sathi observed, sometimes a classroom is treated as something less than a sacred shared space and something more like a hostage situation. During the pandemic, one of the ways in which this has been, of course, on grand display is through the ongoing fetishization of the concept of rigor. Rigor is, of course, a mask for many things, as Karen Costa points to over here, including trauma, tradition, insecurity, incompetence, fear, anger, and it most often, I would suggest, manifests in the form of inflexibility. Hence, whenever I hear someone talk about rigor, my mind immediately goes to rigor mortis, that post-mortem rigidity that involves the stiffening of the body's muscles. No, you may not have an extension. Yes, you must keep your camera on. No, I will not cut any content from this course. Yes, you must hand over your intellectual property to this plagiarism detection platform. No, I will not excuse your absence until I see a copy of the obituary notice. People, what are we doing? Seriously, the harm. As Douglas Dowland recently wrote, the rhetoric of rigor turns pedagogy into pathology. And so I want to give you a lighter illustration of what I mean. And in this case, I'm going to show you a brief clip from the film Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. Take a look.
Go on, Seamus, go on, get it.
Good morning, children. Ordinary wizarding level examinations. OWLs, more commonly known as owls. Study hard and you will be rewarded. Fail to do so and the consequences may be severe. Your previous instruction in this subject has been disturbingly uneven, but you'll be pleased to know from now on you will be following a carefully structured, ministry-approved course of defensive magic. Yes.
There's nothing in here about using defensive spells?
Using spells? Well, I can't imagine why you would need to use spells in my classroom.
We're not going to use magic.
You will be learning about defensive spells in a secure, risk-free way.
Well, what use is that? If we're going to be attacked, it won't be risk-free.
Students will raise their hands when they speak in my class. It is the view of the ministry that a theoretical knowledge will be sufficient to get you through your examinations, which, after all, is what school is all about.
Mm-hmm. It's funny how the clip also reminds me of the discussion yesterday during Lindsay's keynote about the tension between structure and growth. Because Dolores Umbridge, the teacher in this scene, doesn't really strike me as the sort of character that would embrace ungrading, for example, right? But this scene also, I think, touches on the value of applied and active learning, which also, as Lindsay mentioned yesterday, is a powerful approach that disproportionately benefits minoritized students. But perhaps the funniest part of this scene, at least in my view, is what comes right after this, which is when Umbridge taps on the blackboard, and this results in the words course aims appearing on the board. And there are three that come up. Number one, understanding the principles underlying defensive magic. Two, learning to recognize situations in which defensive magic can legally be used. And three, placing the use of defensive magic in a context for practical use. And I don't know about you, but it really makes so much sense to me that one of the most despised characters in the Harry Potter universe is obsessed with learning outcomes. So don't get me wrong, I do understand the value of constructive alignment and ensuring that your activities, assessments, and outcomes relate to each other. But I confess I've always found it just a little bit odd that we can pretend to describe a learning journey before we've ever met any of our students, as though the journey cannot, and perhaps even worse, should not be shaped by them. So when Lindsay shared yesterday that she didn't cover any content during the first 3 weeks of a course during the current semester, but instead focused on community building, my heart sang. But I know there would have been gasps out there, right? In various hallways and in certain departments, in certain offices, for example. But this is precisely, in my mind, the kind of human-centered approach that Bell Hooks wrote about. Whoops, I want to share this with you. And Lindsay quoted from Hooks yesterday. And I want to share this. This, for me, is something that is at the core of my approach and philosophy when it comes to teaching. To teach in a manner that respects and cares for the souls of our students is essential if we are to provide the necessary conditions where learning can most deeply and intimately begin, right? This is music to my ears. Now, talked about my dance background, but I'm talking about music. So you should know that I'm also an ukulelist. I play the ukulele. And so it's an instrument I adore. Again, a little context. I picked it up a few years ago. It's accessible. It has 4 strings. At some point, I might graduate to 6, but I'm happy with 4 at the moment. And so I learned from some folks on YouTube, took some classes at a local school pre-pandemic. And I have to tell you, this is a very interesting instrument, in part because of the mix of people who are drawn to pick it up. And so the class I entered, imagine 25 people in a small space, all strumming away. I mean, it really kind of builds a fabulous energy. And so we played, we built our skills together, we assisted each other. We definitely did more collectively than we could have done ourselves. And we sang. And it wasn't a singing class, but it may as well have been. And I'm sharing this with you because when I think about that experience as an educator, I think about what I want for my students. I want them to do more with each other than they could do individually. I want them to follow their passion, be able to explore it independently. I want them to be surprised by how many skills they develop. I want them to experience joy. And of course, many of these things only come when students step outside of their comfort zone. Now, yesterday, several people in the chat were talking about Vygotsky's zone of proximal development, right? But I think there's a little bit of a paradox over here. Because as educators, as much as we want our students to step outside of their comfort zone, we hope for this as we are happily ensconced, enveloped, insulated, protected within our own comfort zones. Comfort zones that comprise of our favorite stories, activities, reading, assessments, policies, even disciplines. And I don't mean to suggest that this is a bad thing necessarily, because as a former dancer, again, I know I was able to perform well extemporaneously only when I had a solid foundation and a strong basic technique. And so I think the stories, activities, reading, assessments, policies, and disciplines that we've experienced during, when our training wheels came off effectively, provide us with that foundation. And we refine and tweak these, right? As we go, we respond to the music in the room, to the melodies of curiosity, to the chorus of different experiences. But the real transformation occurs when we try something new, something that makes us nervous, even when that thing can fall flat on its face, when we risk feeling embarrassed or judged by our peers or students. But that is where growth happens, right? When the magic occurs outside of our comfort zones, out in the open. And this is even where sharing comes in. I see a lot of inhibition when it comes to sharing outside of groups like this. Sometimes it's because there's imposter syndrome. People are afraid of being found out. In other cases, it's because you don't want your secret sauce to be stolen. So there's a lot of inhibition when it comes to open learning and sharing when it comes to teaching and learning. So all of that, I think, requires swimming against the current. And that's true with taking a human-centered approach with much of our work in the academy. And so I understand this, as I framed in this talk, through really 3 lenses. There's critical pedagogy, there's inclusive design, and there's open pedagogy. And those are just 3 of many. But those are ones I want to take you through. Now, in order to take you through critical pedagogy at first, I actually want to begin with an illustration. Because I think ideology is very clearly baked into our learning environments and teaching practices. And this is an illustration from 1901 that depicts what a school classroom might have looked like in the year 2000. So they're forecasting almost a century at this point. And I think it's easy to look at this image and chuckle at how badly they got it wrong, right? But I want to encourage you to look very closely and try and understand the ideology it represents. What does it say about the role of the professor in the classroom, about his purpose and his methods? And when I say his, of course, I definitely mean an older white male, that holder of wisdom and arbiter of civilization, that it is his job to take knowledge and received wisdom, at least that which was well enough aligned with traditional power structures to be printed and bound, to take those volumes and feed them into an efficient parallel information relay system. Whoops, let me go back. You've got a young teaching assistant on the right, of course, who's actually engaging in the physical labor over here to power the delivery of information. And so the students as well, all young white males appear to be listening quietly, somehow receiving the information. There's no active learning. Lindsay would not be impressed. No evidence of deep processing. There does not even appear to be the need to take note, no pure collaboration. This is like the lowest rung of Bloom's taxonomy on full display, right? And so I suppose, you could argue, if you really want to reach for it, that maybe this is a hybrid delivery with a face-to-face experience combined with electronic transmission of information. Maybe you could argue that this is personalized learning because maybe the lessons have been adapted by algorithm to ensure that it reaches each student and meets their unique needs, right? But I think we all know we're reaching. So this is not what we would generally consider today to be a model environment for teaching and learning. And so, but at the same time, I think although the surface structure is certainly different, our faculty and students today are a lot more diverse, thankfully, of course. But I worry that a lot of how we operate today still reflects these same assumptions. So I'm going to suggest that this is not just the classroom of the year 2000. It may well be the classroom of the year 2022. Because I think what this is a manifestation of, a reflection of, is what the Brazilian educator and philosopher Paulo Freire described as the banking concept of education. As he wrote in his book, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, this approach to education turns them, that's students, into containers to be filled by the teacher. The more completely she fills the receptacles, the better a teacher she is. And the more meekly the receptacles permit themselves to be filled, the better students they are. And so education thus becomes the act of depositing, in which students are the depositories and the teacher is the depositor. This last sentence has a lot going on. In the banking concept of education, knowledge is a gift. It's bestowed by those who consider themselves knowledgeable upon those whom they consider to know nothing. Certainly encourage you to read this book if you have the opportunity. But beyond the physical classroom, let's also consider digital learning spaces. And I'm going to talk about the learning management system to start. Think about how this is set up to facilitate the transmission of information one way, right? Trickling down. And so each course is a silo, separate and distinct, because as we all know, learning is separate and distinct. Different disciplines don't talk to one another, and even courses in the same program don't talk to one another. How could learning in the context of a geography course, for example, on climate change, ever be relevant to a course on conservation psychology the next semester? And so Audrey Waters is somebody whose work I follow very closely. She writes about the learning management system, or the LMS, and she describes it as a piece of administrative software. Well, first of all, there's that word management in there, which sort of gives it away, right? As though learning is something that's best managed. That this software that purports to address questions about teaching and learning, but that really works to manage and administer, in turn, often circumscribing pedagogical possibilities. The LMS silo, Waters writes, works because we tend to view each classroom as a closed entity, because we view each subject or discipline as atomistic and distinct, closed, centralized, controlled in the hands of administrators, teachers, and IT, but rarely in the hands of learners. And consider also how we treat student work in the learning management system, right? At the end of every semester, you might possibly archive your course shell in order to reuse that architecture in a future offering, right? But typically the one thing we do before we archive the course shell for the future is we wipe all traces of student activity. And what a terrific confirmation of that devaluation of student expertise and intellectual labor, right? We told you at the start of the journey, you're not really going to change how we're going to do things. And at the end, we've confirmed what you contributed. Yeah, not that useful to the world. We don't need to do this, right? We can co-create course syllabi with our students. We can leave room for them to select where their interests are most ignited. We can co-create course policies with students, schedules, work, even assessments. And so this is a slide from Lindsay's talk yesterday, right? She talked about pedagogical practices for shared power. She talked about ungrading, community agreements, co-creation of assignments, a student bill of rights. And you can see the theme of learner agency is woven throughout these practices. And while these practices, I think, may initially seem threatening, at least some of them, what I urge you to do is not think about these as a loss of a control for you as a faculty member, but instead as providing learners with more agency. This is not a zero sum. As Henry Giroux writes, critical pedagogy asserts that students can engage their own learning from a position of agency. It takes seriously the educational imperative to encourage students to act on the knowledge, values, and social relations they acquire by being responsive to the deepest and most important problems of our times. Big words, but what does that mean? What does this look like in practice? Well, consider, for example, KPU's Open Pedagogy Fellowship. This is an international, interinstitutional, cross-disciplinary program that involves faculty from different institutions working together to design assignments wherein students create resources, and those resources support progress towards specific sustainable development goals. Now, the SDGs, as they're commonly referred to, are a set of 17 grand challenges facing humanity. They include things like reducing poverty, climate action, gender equality. And this, what's on the screen over here, is one of my favorite examples where 3 faculty members, one from urban ecosystems, one from sustainable horticulture, one from anthropology, they designed an assignment that addressed food insecurity on our campuses by mapping food access and also creating a public, openly licensed database that identified all of the edible weeds on our campuses. It was creative, meaningful, and I think a wonderful example of authentic assessment that tackled a critical social problem. But what makes this even more powerful is that the resources that the students created were published with an open license. And that's what makes this not just critical pedagogy, but open pedagogy. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with the term, open pedagogy can be understood in more than one way, but it can be understood as an access-oriented commitment to learner-driven education. But it's really also a process of using tools for learning and building architectures for learning that allow students to shape the public knowledge commons, of which they are a part. And you can learn more about this approach at the Open Pedagogy Notebook, which is a sort of a library of such assignments, course design approaches that Robin DeRosa and I created. So just visit openpedagogy.org. An especially popular expression of open pedagogy comes with the design and use of what are known as renewable assignments, also known as non-disposable assignments. And I know that's a curious term, but I think it accurately captures how disposably traditional assessments are often treated, right? Because after they're graded, after they're picked up, they often end up in the recycling bin, treated with the same disdain that students' discussion forum posts are at the end of the semester in the LMS. And so open pedagogy can look like Wikipedia assignments, wherein students work to author and refine and improve articles in a range of psychology topics as part of their coursework, often with the assistance of groups like the Wiki Education Foundation or the Association for Psychological Science, for example. Open pedagogy, let me actually, before I give you the next example, let me show you. This is a glimpse at how students feel about these kinds of assignments. And I would say, having done this a lot, you would be amazed at the energy, creativity that students pour into this work, and especially the pride that they derive from their work when they recognize that this is meaningful to the world, that this is going to have a greater impact, a bigger audience, and a longer life than what they're accustomed to being asked to do. Open pedagogy can look like students creating instructional videos, such as these two students from Simon Fraser University here in BC, who effectively explained Cialdini's principles of persuasion. Incidentally, the students over here won first prize in an international student video competition organized by the folks at the NOBA project. But more important than the monetary prize and the recognition, the magic of open pedagogy means that the work of these students, published with an open Creative Commons license available on YouTube, is used by faculty across the world to teach the science of persuasion, right? That's the power of this. Open pedagogy can look like students writing op-ed pieces instead of their 18th research essay as part of their undergraduate degree, as demonstrated in this award-winning assignment posted to the Social Psychology Network. And you think about it, it's 500 to 750 words of tight, punchy writing. It draws on their budding expertise and even allows them to leave the course with a publication. Open pedagogy can involve turning traditional multiple choice based quizzes right on its heads. When I did this in my social psychology course, instead of asking my students to answer multiple choice questions, I asked them to write them, right? Because think for a moment about how deeply you need to understand a concept in order to write 3 plausible distractors. You need to understand it quite deeply. And so this was a scaffolded exercise, of course. I first had students write a single new distractor for an existing question, then 2 distractors, then 3. And in a few weeks, they were writing entirely new questions themselves, right? The stem and all. And then these were peer reviewed. And so by the end of the course, my small class, it was 35 students, had written 1,400 questions. And then I repeated the exercise the next semester with the next cohort. And of course, one of the more fun elements of this kind of an approach is I promised them that the best questions would end up on the midterm examination. And I was looking for this, right? I'm invigilating the exam, I'm watching, and there's this look of just delight and surprise when a student spots their own question on the exam. Why not? It's a terrific question, right? And so this last assignment wasn't just an example of open pedagogy, because it also revolved around the use of an open textbook for social psychology, which you can see on the left. It's one of the open textbooks that I've helped adapt. In this case, we created an international edition, right? And so for those of you who don't know, open textbooks are a type of open educational resource, or OER. Right? OER are teaching and learning resources that are published with an open license, and it doesn't matter what they are. They could be textbooks, instructional videos, interactive simulations, lesson plans, much more. But publication with an open license means that the copyright holders are choosing in advance how they are willing to let people reuse their work in the future without having to approach them for permission. So you can choose to say, yes, you can keep this permanently. You can choose to say you can keep it, but you can't change it. Or you can say, well, you're welcome to change it. You can update it, you can translate it, you can localize it. You have control and you decide what permissions you want to give people in advance. And so some of my favorite examples of OER in psychology include things like the interactive simulations published by the University of Colorado at Boulder, including this one to demonstrate neural communication. Right? This is all openly licensed, freely reusable, downloadable, put it in your LMS. Students do not need to pay for any of this. Or for example, the statistical visualization tools published by Christopher Magnuson. It's beautiful. And this is just an example, but God, if you teach stats, you should be going to the website. It's our psychologist, by the way. Or you can look at the extensive and high quality teaching resources published by the NOBA project. And for those of you who don't know, this was founded by Ed and Carol Diener, right? And some of you will know Ed Diener's work in terms of subjective well-being work. He recently passed, but this is a huge legacy that he's left to us in the field. And of course, you can look at the many, many, many peer-reviewed open textbooks that you can very easily find at the University of Minnesota's Open Textbook Library. And I'm proud to say that one of the open textbooks in this library, or one of over 1,000 at this point, is this one. It's one that I worked on, which is now in its 4th edition, Research Methods in Psychology. So it's published by my university. It's available for you and your students to freely reuse, as it currently is right across the world. Now, incidentally, I got involved in creating, adapting, and adopting OER because I learned about the problem of textbook affordability. And I want to touch on this a bit because I think no matter where you work, it could be an R1 institution, teaching intensive university like mine, or community college, we are all familiar with the recurring chorus of emails from students at the start of every semester, right? Hey, prof, do I really need this book? Can I use an older edition? Right? So, and I know sometimes faculty respond to these emails, at least internally, with that eye roll that Lindsay talked about, with some derision, with some contempt. I hear things like, if you value your education, you should buy this book. Or if they had money for beer, they have money for textbooks, we tell each other. Right? But this is, I think, a woefully underinformed and damaging way of thinking. For one, many faculty don't realize that the cost of commercial textbooks rose by over 1,000% between 1977, when the Bureau of Labor Statistics began gathering those data, and 2018. And even if you look at the last 20 years, as in this chart, you will see that costs have risen about 3 times on average, the rate of inflation. There's been a bit of a plateau the last 2-3 years, in fact, and that's in part because of the open textbook adoptions and other major affordability initiatives. But yet, I would say one of the things I still see is that many faculty, when they assign books, they have no idea what the precise cost is of those resources, because we effectively have a principal agent dilemma here. So, tuition is a known expense. The cost of textbooks is unknown to students until the start of the semester, or they walk into the bookstore. And so even prior to the pandemic, the cost of textbooks was negatively affecting student access, success, and completion. Here are the data from a major study in Florida with more than 21,000 students drawn from every single degree granting institution in the state. And it showed that nearly 2/3 of students didn't purchase at least one of their required textbooks because of cost. 43% or so took fewer courses, 41% not registering for a specific course, 23% dropping a course, again, all because of the high cost of textbooks. That's how that sentence ends in that survey. And what's more worrying is that these choices are disproportionately likely to be made by students who are already marginalized, including first-gen students and students of color. And I'll show you one more illustration of this. Right? For me, the real calculus of the undergraduate degree is now how much of my grade is coming from the auto-graded homework quizzing platform. Is it 35%? If so, I'm going to drop the course and take another one. If it's 10%, I'll take the hit on my grade and I won't buy that code, right? This is what's happening. And think about how many of those questions now have to do with this issue. In 2019, nearly 167,000 students from 171 two-year institutions and 56 four-year institutions responded to the college survey that was run by the Hope Center for College Community and Justice. This is based at Temple University in Philly. The results indicate that 46% of respondents were housing insecure during the previous year, and 39% of respondents were food insecure in the previous 30 days. And think about those numbers for a moment and imagine how many of those questions about, hey, do I really need the book? May I use an older edition? How many of those are actually symptoms of food or housing insecurity? Now, of course, the commercial textbook industry has been well aware of this. I'm going to quote directly over here from the CEO of Cengage as just one example, who in 2018 wrote this. There are millions of students out there who are making very painful trade-offs in the purchase of learning materials relative to paying the rent, paying for basic needs, food, etc. We as an industry, he said, have chosen for a long time to basically ignore that, or have more or less been paying lip service to them. And I share this just in case you ever wondered whether a primary obligation to shareholders could ever fully be reconciled with a primary duty to students. But then we should all know this, because as faculty members, we have long been accustomed to the so-called new editions of textbooks roll out with only cosmetic changes, right? We know that a textbook publisher only makes money the first time a book is sold, not when it's resold downstream. And so this motivated me to go on to conduct research on the perceptions of open textbooks by students and faculty to study their efficacy, specifically the impact of open and commercial textbooks in psychology on educational outcomes. And what I found was what most of the literature has found in this area, which is that students assigned free and open textbooks tend to perform just as well, or sometimes better, than those assigned expensive commercial textbooks. And what is more, just as the burden of high textbook costs disproportionately falls on marginalized students, the benefits of open textbooks accrue disproportionately in favor of those same marginalized students. Take, for example, this large-scale study of nearly 22,000 students from the state of Georgia, which found that the use of OER improved end-of-course grades and decreased DFW rates, right? And that's the proportion of students who earn a D, an F, or withdrew from the course. But they also improve course grades at greater rates and decrease DFW rates at greater rates for Pell recipient students, part-time students, and populations historically underserved by higher ed. In other words, I learned that OER benefited students not just in economic, but also in educational terms. And this in turn led me to work to advocate for the adoption of OER. And so it led me to work with colleagues, for example, to help others to see how they can move their teaching practices to being from content-centric to more process-centric, like Lindsay talked about, from being more teacher-centric to also including learner-centrism, and primarily for pedagogical purposes to actually primarily being for social justice. So over the years, working with groups such as the NOBA Project and BC Campus here in my backyard and the Open Ed Network and others, it's taught me a few things. It's taught me that it doesn't take a lot to significantly make students' lives better as an individual faculty member. The decision to switch from a commercial to an open textbook isn't really much more effort than switching from one commercial textbook to another. But it helped me to not underestimate the impact of my small choices, of how working in open education can support not just social justice, but also pedagogical innovation. It helped me to better understand some of the more systemic barriers in higher ed, how exploitative our systems can be. It helped me to understand that sometimes it is better to build a new table instead of waiting to be seated at a table, especially if that table doesn't respect your dignity. It helped me to find ways in which we can redesign these systems so that they're more inclusive and supportive of both students and faculty. And it reaffirmed for me how my scholarship, particularly scholarship of teaching and learning, can help strengthen and guide this work. As a person of color in the academy, you are well aware of how few people there are who look like you. Throughout my undergraduate and graduate career, I didn't have a single course that was taught by an instructor of color. So I'm very grateful to be here. And I know things have changed along the way. But as an instructor of color, you certainly see how important it is to students who look like you, right? So you serve, you hold your tongue, you wear tokenized, you develop a thicker skin. And for me, the challenge is always, how do I develop a thicker skin without developing a harder heart, if that makes sense? And you slowly accumulate what social psychologists will refer to as idiosyncrasy credits, right? So that's enough time, service, and sweat so that your colleagues are willing to give you the benefit of doubt so that you can begin to acceptably deviate from group expectations. You challenge systems and you speak up too soon, and you will quickly see that words such as collegiality and civility are weaponized against you, right? It is a fine line, and it's so fine, it may as well be a razor's edge. But if you're in this for justice, you need to be in this for the long game. And when you see progress take place, when you see allies speak up, when you see students thrive, when you see community build, it gives you hope. And so I will always remember Toni Morrison's words about when you get these jobs that you've been so brilliantly trained for, just remember your real job is that if you are free, you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then your job is to empower somebody else. I carry the wisdom of Bell Hooks with me, who wrote that all of us in the academy and in the culture as a whole are called to renew our minds if we are to transform educational institutions and society so that the way that we live, teach, and work can reflect our joy in cultural diversity, our passion for justice, and our love for freedom. And I hold on to the powerful words of Arundhati Roy, who said that another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. And so as I close, I will return to the image that was on my title slide, lurking behind the title. And I'll pause to ask if anyone recognizes the mountain range that is on the screen. This is a photograph I took when I had the opportunity to travel some years ago. I'll give you a clue. It's in the southern hemisphere. Don't you always have to remind yourself as an instructor? Don't rush it. Wait. Fair, Lindsay, fair. Well, for those of you who have the opportunity to visit, I do recommend that you go to Cape Town in the future. I was in Cape Town in South Africa, and what you're looking at is actually downtown Cape Town below that mountain range, and the mountain range is Table Mountain. It's beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful. But as you can see, I'm self-evidently not in Cape Town when I took this photograph. I'm across the water. Where I was Robben Island. And for those of you who are unfamiliar, Robben Island was originally a leper colony, in fact, before it became a high security prison for political prisoners. This is where, among other inmates, Nelson Mandela spent 18 years of his prison sentence. It's an extraordinary place, honestly. And when I had the opportunity to visit, it was a real privilege for so many reasons. But one of them is that the tour guides, when I visited, were still all former inmates of the prison. And so we got to have conversations with them to understand, how did you maintain hope? What were those small daily acts of resistance, especially when the injustice is literally right in front of you? And for me, I remember this experience and I'm passionate about it, and I hold on to this. It energizes me because for me, it reminds me of what education is at its finest, right? Because for me, education at its finest is democratizing. It is liberatory. It is anti-racist. It is decolonizing. It is critical. It is inclusive, and it is open. Can't wait to get your questions and your comments, but thank you very much for all of your attention over the last hour. So as I said, I'd love to, you don't even have to have a question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, your reflections, learn from your experience, but I'm also very, very happy to answer any questions you might have along the way. Ada, I'm looking at, how much time do you think we have? About 15 minutes, maybe, close to it? Yeah.
Yeah, we have about 10 or 15 minutes for open dialogue.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, everyone. I appreciate the kind feedback. Hey, Lindsay. Sorry, Lindsay and I are I don't know how to describe our relationship at this point, quite frankly, but our relationship is disproportionate to the amount of physical time we spent together because we kind of think we recognize each other's souls. So we have sung live band karaoke together. We have done massive dance-offs in a small room. Yeah, so kindred spirit for sure.
I have a question. I'm always interested to get people's perspectives on this because I tend to use physical books in my classrooms as opposed to having them bring ebooks and things like that. And I always struggle because I know that there are cost trade-offs and things like that, but I did a number of semesters where I did surveys at the end of the semester, and I asked them, would you recommend that I continue using a physical book, an ebook, or both? And upwards of 85% of them said both.
Yep, that's usually what you see. Yeah.
And so I always struggle with open access because I don't know how necessary. And I know some of them have physical copies that are print on demand, and we don't yet have print on demand. So I'm always interested to hear what people who advocate for open access, what your strategies are for addressing that aspect of the textbook kind of thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. It's been a core part of it. And of course, I'm two hats over here. One is as an instructor who does this work, but second as an administrator who supports this work for my institution. So in general, I would say, yeah, students, if cost is not a constraint, they prefer to have it all, right? Typically, they will want, for example, the print copy at home. They will want the flexibility of mobile access and digital access when they're on the road, so they don't have to lug the book around and all of this stuff. Increasingly, I think, originally a lot of this was focused on physically highlighting, annotating, but in recent years, with the development of really, easy and freely accessible digital annotation tools, and I'll give you an example. Hypothesis is the name of a plugin that is open source technology in your Chrome browser that you can use to digitally annotate, even collaboratively annotate all open textbooks, for example, or highlight. So that's helped. But in general, I would say there's a couple of things. Open textbooks, having a print option has always been important. As an institution, we certainly do this. It's actually a significant source of a revenue stream for our bookstore. And bookstores have historically been losing revenue, by the way, as fewer and fewer students are buying books from them. And so this is actually quite a win-win. The difference is when you print and sell print copies of open textbooks, first of all, you have the right to do so. That's part of the open licensing. So even if your institution didn't publish them, you can do that. Students can do it themselves, right? They can go to Kinko's or whatever they want, but you can organize it in a way that's nicely bound and all of that. And your bookstore can generate revenue from that. But the difference is you're not paying, you're just paying the cost of printing, overhead, and the profit margin of the bookstore, which means that a 400-page textbook is about $25 instead of $250. So it's a huge difference. And so in general, the approach we take is, look, you don't have to buy the print, but print is an option, and we want to make that option affordable. And this is really important for us because part of this is also recognizing that and we saw this during the pandemic, if you assume that the digital is the solution, you're going to exacerbate existing inequities in society, right? Who has a laptop, a tablet, who has access to reliable access to technology? And so the books need to be downloadable, they need to be usable offline in digital format, for example, but a print option is really important. If you don't have it at your institution, I would look at any consortiums that you're a part of. You could set it up on lulu.com, on Amazon Print Direct. You get these all over the place. But the big thing is the institution or the individual has the right to do this. And you can do this at, as I said, a fraction of the cost. My open textbook on research methods is available on Amazon. I think it's $12 US. It's crazy when you think about it. Beautifully, like perfectly bound, right? And gorgeous and delivered. And you can calibrate that. So like we get zero royalties. Right? We purposely said it. The three of us as authors have said, no, we want no royalties at all for this. And that's as cheaply as it can be done. So yeah, you don't have to build the infrastructure, piggyback on others if you like. But I would say that making sure that you are not, with the best of intentions, perpetuating inequities and exacerbating them is critically important. So depending on where you are, there could be big groups that have trodden this path in your backyard, and I would encourage you to reach out to them. One of the nice things about the open ed community is everybody immediately knows and recognizes that, look, there's no competition in open ed, because if your institution advances, if I publish something, you will benefit. If you publish something, we will reuse it over here. And so it's a very different mentality than the typical kind of territoriality you see in this space. So, and if you want, just follow up with me later. I've worked with enough organizations in the US that I will find you who you need to get this going.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
You bet. I should say, I'll try to pick up one of the efficacy study I mentioned that we did, actually purposely did this even in terms of outcomes as well. And we randomly assigned, I mean, it wasn't in my classes because obviously, I'm biased. So I recruited instructors and I randomly assigned them to teach with the incumbent commercial book or the open textbook. And then within the open textbook, it was either print or digital. And we even looked at outcomes that way. It was really quite fascinating. And yeah, there wasn't any significant difference between the two digital formats. But interestingly, as I said, same thing. The open textbook sections outperformed. I suspect a lot of this has to do with the access hypothesis, frankly, that there was a good chunk of students who wouldn't have bought the book anyway, and they're now no longer having to try and answer midterm exam questions without having access to the readings. But it's a consistent finding.
Valerie, I think you have a question.
Ooh.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I'm not going to show my video. I was just eating. So
Okay.
turn my video on. But thank you so much for your talk. One of the things that I was just thinking about when you were talking about, the instructor who kind of took the time to take you aside and, ask you a question and, went above and beyond, kind of makes me think back to something that Lindsay was saying yesterday about, one of the sins, giving your all to teaching and whatnot. So I just wanted to know your thoughts, because I think that's something that, I sometimes struggle with. It's like, I always really want to be there for every, one of my students. And so I just wanted to get your thoughts on maybe how we could do that, but also keep in mind of, as to take from Lindsay's yesterday, maybe some boundaries or whatnot. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm in full agreement with Lindsay over here. I think you have to look at this in the long-term sense, right? And I certainly, I'm gonna answer with a couple of different lenses over here, or different hats. One is I'll speak as an administrator who was placed in charge of teaching and learning strategy and operations 1 month before the pandemic hit. And so in some ways, people who worked in teaching and learning centers, I would say it's sort of like you were the fire department at a time when every single person's house was on fire at the same time. So that was another space where I've seen over the last 2 years dealing with pandemic teaching and learning, where there's been this push and pull. And initially, I will say, just a general observation, there was so much of a loss of control for faculty, right? What's familiar, the environment, new technologies, I can't do this, I have to change for this, the assessment, what am I gonna, all of that, let alone the fears about health and safety and that. And so what I did see was several different reactions. And one of them was a real desire to try and reclaim control in many ways. And some of that involved, trying to squeeze face-to-face pedagogy into an online space, right? And sort of trying to say, no, I want you to, stare without blinking for 30 minutes into your webcam while I watch you write an exam, like some asinine stuff like that. And so there's that. But I will say there's a real challenge over here, because in general, I think individual efforts are not a replacement for systemic change. And so I will recognize the ongoing challenge of how much work faculty have been asked to do and keeping us to do, the devaluing of labor in the academy, the amount of invisible labor in the academy. And so I will say, in general, we're not dealing with a neutral context, right? The neoliberal university is very much upon us. And so we're dealing with this general challenge of devaluing and the sort of commoditization of our work in a way that doesn't recognize the value of where our magic really lies. And so that's the broader context. And so for me, I look at this as, look, there's a lot that we could do. You do need to look after yourself. Care for others needs to involve self-care, undoubtedly. Otherwise, you will burn out, unquestionably. And so, I say this as a leader, where for my team, I will do anything for my team. I will advocate for them. But taking a buck stops with me kind of approach only really works if you can be dealt out for a hand or two occasionally, right? You need to look after yourself. And Lord knows, particularly for those of us who are trying to actively engineer culture change within the academy, it is exhausting long-term work, right? Revolution, it reminds me of Audre Lorde over here. Revolution is not a one-time event. And so you need to keep your energy up. You need to identify your allies, be very pragmatic about this. Sometimes I'm very, selective about where I want to expend my, political capital, where I want to advance things. But I will say that you don't have to do it alone. You can do small things. And those small things make a huge difference, because you can start to signal what's not just, permissible and encouraged, but what is celebrated. It's challenging to change this culture within the academy, but for those of us who attend teaching and learning conferences in psychology, we already represent a process of change, right? We're at that end of our discipline where it's not that we're going to walk into the classroom and resent the time we spend with our students, like those of our colleagues who care more about research than their teaching and learning experiences, for example. Our heart is already here. So I think you need to pace yourself. You do need to care for yourself. It's never going to get there, right? Lindsay talked about the growth curve yesterday. But I would say be gentle with yourself, be kind to yourself, because recognize that systemic change is a very long game. And so I would reinforce Lindsay's message yesterday about self-care. At the same time, I think you don't have to do a lot, even some of the things I'm talking about, I don't mean to suggest that you need to kind of burn it all down and start from scratch. Although believe me, there are days where, I have quite a supply of matches at this point, but sometimes all it takes is small nudges and the signals you send. And you start to normalize an approach where talking about, what if we were to rebuild systems? What if we were just as a thought exercise, no matter what the question is you're dealing with in your particular context, in your department, at that moment in your class, take a step back. Maybe just ask yourself this: if the system didn't already exist, this is how I would build it, right? And in some ways, even the question about open textbooks and commercial textbooks is a smaller question. The bigger question is textbooks. What kind of a strange, impoverished approach to pedagogy that involves a textbook? I mean, we're bending our courses to map onto the table of contents of a book, please. So there's that. So I certainly have that, I will work with the systems that we have, but I will push for systemic change that is much more radical, right? What does that meme say? I will play with the mean, but I would much rather party with the outliers. And so pace yourself, be kind to yourself. This is a long game, but the main thing is recognize your allies. I mean, working with Lindsay, talking to her gives me energy. And I hope some of this conversation today does for yourself as well, but take it easy. This is a long game. And sometimes you just need to give a student that glimmer of hope that, you belong, somebody cares. That's all it takes sometimes, honestly, to radically change somebody's life. It certainly did for me.
Thank you so much.